Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I really appreciate it. And I'm so sorry that I can't be there today in person, but there is a very, very good reason, which is very much founded on what I want to talk about today. So I wanted to ask you, have you ever felt confronted by that question, why, when someone that you know, or even someone that you don't know, has taken their own life? I have found that by leaning towards, not away from, the deeper questioning that suicide elicits about what it means to live, it's possible to find greater meaning, purpose, compassion in our lives. Research tells us that for every single person that dies by suicide, up to 135 people are directly impacted by that death, leaving them at greater risk of social isolation, of depression, of anxiety, and of post-traumatic stress disorder, but also of suicide itself. And it's not only family members that are impacted, it is friends, colleagues, and first responders, to name just a few. And you don't have to actually know the person to have an increased risk of suicide after exposure to a suicide death. So hence we know that suicide postvention, which is the support that we offer to people who have been impacted by suicide, is also a really vital part of suicide prevention. Yet we fail to adequately use this knowledge. We turn away from the conversation around suicide. And in so doing, we are failing to not only keep the public and our communities safe, but also our first responders. It is the 22nd of November, 1988, and I'm 17 years old. And a violent, destructive fire engulfs my family home, decimating it. And that fire is the suicide of my beloved 20-year-old brother, Adam. On the surface, he had everything that we all aspire to be and to want. He was good looking, charismatic, tall, dark, and handsome. He was a straight A student, and he was deeply loved and admired, and a shining light. And from the moment that he died, I became haunted by that question, why? And it never left me. There were things before that time that had primed the fire conditions. If we had had a bushfire hazard rating, it would have read extreme. My father suffered from lifelong mental illness, from depression, bipolar disorder, and schizoaffective disorder. And his mother had also suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. My mother was diagnosed with cancer when I was 8, and she died when I was 13. And at that point, my father had quite a severe psychotic episode, which saw him admitted to a psychiatric hospital for the best part of a year. And so my brother, my sister, and I were left alone in our house. And as a 13-year-old, after my mother's death, we fumbled on blindly, and none of us knew how to grieve. And I really hoped that that grief would somehow unite us, but it didn't. And I turned to my brother Adam, looking for some sense of safety in the world at a time when it didn't feel that the world was a safe place. And we had a really unspoken bond. We weren't able to speak about our grief, but we cared deeply for each other and we protected each other. And I really had no idea of the grief that was metastasizing in him. I just had a sense of foreboding. And as I said, on the 21st of November, the trajectory of my life changed forever. And after his death, I had no longer knew how to live in the world. My world, my home, my life had been obliterated, and my home had been burned to the ground. 4 weeks after his death, on Christmas Eve in 1988, I found myself at the age of 17 standing in a pub in North London, and I felt like I was suffocating. I couldn't breathe, and I just felt this need to get out, and I ran out onto Hampstead Heath, a big park in North London, into the darkness. And eventually I stopped and I fell to my knees and I let out a blood-curdling scream. And in that scream, there was just one word, and that was that word, why? And I scratched at the grass in search of answers. And that word in that moment never left me. And I wrote to a friend who was overseas at the time, and I said, I don't want to die, but I don't know how to live. And that's exactly how it felt to me, because the scaffolding of my life really lay in ashes at my feet. At 17 years old, a fire had destroyed my family home and all that I loved. And fires can decimate everything in their path. They're hot, angry, disorientating, and they elicit immense fear. And fires create panic. And I started having panic attacks, and I didn't know what a panic attack was. I just knew that felt like I was suffocating. Have you ever had some tragedy, some fire sweep through your life that threatens to engulf you? And just when you're about to succumb to the flames, someone throws you a lifeline to guide you out of that darkness. And my lifeline was Newcastle Rotary upon Tyne in Northern England, who sponsored me to take part in an expedition to Zimbabwe to undertake community work. And on the first anniversary of my brother's death, I was using my hands to dig the foundations of what would later become a school block in a remote village in Zimbabwe. And I worked alongside local community members who had nothing but huge hearts and big smiles. And that 3-month expedition to Zimbabwe was really pivotal for me. It turned me away from the darkness and showed me just an inkling of light. And I learned then that the essence of life is connection, is compassion and kindness. And I had been invited to speak at Rotary on my return, a commitment it would take me nearly 30 years to fulfill as I fought my way through a tsunami of grief. As I said, fires elicit immense fear, and my life very much became governed by fear. Other people's fear that I would do what my brother had done, and that fueled my own fear. Maybe I was going mad. Maybe I would become like my father or my brother. And I was angry, but just like my grief, I smothered it. And I wanted to lash out, but I kept it all hidden and I swallowed my anger. And fires leave carcinogens, and when ingested, they metastasize, as did my anger. For what remains unprocessed does damage. I felt rejection and abandonment, that my love wasn't enough to keep my brother alive. And how then does that impact your ability to have healthy relationships? And I see very much how the cost of what happened to me was that I was never able to have a family of my own. And I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness, that I wasn't enough. And it drove me to need to rescue people. I became a physiotherapist, I became a surf lifesaver, and I became a firefighter, because my ability to rescue defined my own sense of self-worth. And as I said, I was very much haunted by that question, why? For 15 years, I pushed it all away, and I ran from my anger, my pain, my grief. And I tried to outrun the fire that constantly chased me and threatened to engulf me. And suicide challenges us to our very core. It confronts us so viciously and so joltingly with our deepest fears. For at the foundation of humanity is our will to live. I turned away from the question why and the bigger ones it begs to ask about what it means to live. It terrified me, encroaching on every aspect of my life, morphing into crippling anxiety and shame. And it was only when I started to turn towards that question why, ever so gently, with support and courage, that I found peace and meaning and my path to transformation. Research tells us that for people who are impacted by suicide, it is that question why that differentiates it from other traumatic deaths. So what would it look like if we supported people to turn towards that question, not away from it? If we used it to help people to find their meaning and their peace and purpose in life? In the last 10 years, through my work in the peer support team at Fire and Rescue New South Wales, I have seen how anger manifests after exposure to trauma. Those who try to smother it with alcohol suffer, and those that try to run from it through blaming others suffer. We need to approach suicide not only from a bereavement perspective, but also from a trauma-informed perspective. Suicide is a traumatic death, and trauma, when left unprocessed, does damage. I ask you, what is it that remains unprocessed in your own life? Is there a fire in your life that you try to smother or to run from? What would it look like to confront it with loving support, to stare the fear down, and in so doing, let it lose its power? Let it guide you to your own meaning and purpose. In my early 30s, I hit a turning point when I went to a suicide call at work as a firefighter, and I had a physical reaction to that incident, and I felt like I was reliving my brother's death, and I felt as if I was going to vomit. As I said, fires decimate everything in their path, but they also leave ashes to the ground from which new growth can emerge. And what would it look like if we used our greatest fears to guide and teach us in answering the deeper questions of life about our own meaning and purpose and our own truth? It was only when I started to turn towards the question why that I began to care for my wounds and embrace my scars. I sought help from a psychologist, and I started to turn towards the fear and peel back all the layers I had created around myself to try to keep myself safe. And it was in embracing that vulnerability that I really found my strength. By leaning into the grief and the pain and all that terrified me the most, I began to free myself of everything that kept me living in the dark. I could not have confronted my deepest fears alone. I and we all need loving support to do that. I wrote my life story down like no one was ever going to read it. And that writing turned into a book that has now been published internationally and translated into French and into Mandarin. I re-scripted the story of my life, and I healed the most important relationship of all, the relationship with myself. And suicide fractures that relationship. And I do believe that we can all heal that relationship. For 15 years, I worked on learning to love myself. I prioritized and nurtured my physical, mental, and spiritual health. I used to want to get rid of my scars, and now I hold them gently and with love. I see the beauty and the pain in them, and they make the tapestry of my life so much richer. The darkness in that tapestry also makes the colors so much brighter. My scars no longer define me. I use them to guide me. They have shown me my truth, my meaning, and my purpose, and that is the greatest gift of all. In the end, it was the very question that I was most afraid of that opened the door to the life I wanted and the person that I wanted to be. In 2017, 30 years after my trip to Zimbabwe, I was invited to speak at Des Moines Rotary to share my story, which led to a nomination for the 2017 Rotary Inspirational Woman of the Year Award. It was there that the seed was sown to apply for the Rotary Emergency Services PhD scholarship for research into the mental health of emergency service workers. And it has been in so many ways the completion of a beautiful circle of life. Through that one act of kindness 30 years ago, Rotary across the globe has changed my life, and I hope enabled me to change the lives of others. I hope I can pay forward that £500 investment all those years ago by finding a way through my research to change the public narrative around suicide. The work that I now do is the drawing together of all my life experiences, my work, and my voluntary roles. My role in the peer support team supporting firefighters impacted by trauma and suicide drove me to my PhD, to wanting to hear firefighters' voices and to understand the rich tapestry of their stories so that I could build a solution to their struggles and their pain from the ground up. I saw firefighters struggle with suicide in particular, and with that question, why? As one firefighter said to me who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder after attending the scene of a young boy's suicide, it was a real struggle to try and work out, to try and make some sense of it. It was a real conflict, and I'm petrified to go and be confronted with that again. The Beyond Blue National Survey of Emergency Service Workers' Mental Health tells us that firefighters have twice the rate of suicidal ideation and 3 times the rate of suicide plans compared to the general population. And a recent coronial report tells us that 1 emergency service worker dies by suicide every month in Australia. And we have no idea of the real ripple effect of each death, organisationally, culturally, socially, and psychologically. As firefighters, our entire role, our number one priority in everything that we do is to protect and preserve life. So what happens when you're confronted by the scene of a suicide, where not only have you failed invariably to protect life, but there is an intentional act to end life? How does it challenge your identity and your sense of self-worth? As a firefighter said to me, I couldn't help, I couldn't make the situation better for the family. And another said, I don't know how many I've been to and I don't want to know. To me, that's just a number that I can use to beat myself up, and I don't want to do that. How hard is it to ask for help when from the moment that you put on your uniform, you are perceived as strong and courageous, the person that will save you in some tragedy? How hard is it then to stand up and say help? Evidence tells us that there is a cumulative effect of exposure to suicide, which increases the risk of mental illness and of suicide. And we know that firefighters have high rates of exposure to suicide. So we need to better support our emergency service workers after exposure if we are to prevent suicide and also to reduce distress. Yet there are currently no evidence-informed suicide postvention resources for emergency service workers in Australia. I hope that through collaboration and sharing of knowledge, I and we can change that by developing a suicide preparedness and postvention program that not only reduces mental ill health, distress, and suicidal behavior, but also facilitates growth. So I ask you, what would it look like if collectively we turned towards that question why and supported people to answer that in such a way that built on what it is that makes us actually want to live? At individual, organizational, and community level, we all have our part to play in creating a safe and caring culture that is founded on compassion, kindness, social connectedness, and in assisting people to find their meaning and purpose in life. These are the things that keep us safe from suicide. If we can truly use postvention as prevention, then we can work towards better protecting those that protect us. And maybe, just maybe, we will uncover the missing link in our suicide prevention efforts. So I thank you all so much for listening. And as you watch this, I will be embarking on a journey to cycle unsupported across Australia with a friend to raise money for Lifeline and to create safe and healthy conversation around suicide and mental ill health, as well as raise awareness for two charities for which I am ambassadors for, being Standby Support After Suicide and Fortum Australia, an organisation which supports the mental health and fitness of emergency service workers. So I invite you to please follow our journey on www.cyclingoz.com. And thank you so much again for listening, and have a really, really great conference. I hope you get so much out of it. Thank you.